Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. My guest today is Helle Thorning-Schmidt. She was Prime Minister of Denmark. She is now CEO of Save the Children International. She joins us from London. Thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Your charity is coming out with a new chilling report to mark the 7th anniversary of the Syria war. We thought we had seen the worst already in Syria, but it seems the last month, the last weeks, have shown that the nightmare is even worse than everyone thought.
Exactly. And what we want to show with our new report is that the levels of horror in Syria are actually reaching new heights in these weeks and months. We are seeing new levels of displacement. Every hour, 250 children have become refugees. We are seeing new levels of casualties. Just in the last 6 months of last year, we saw almost 40 civilians losing their lives to bombs every day. We are seeing new levels of bombings against places where people, and particularly children, thought they were safe, hospitals and schools and places where children are. And of course, we are also seeing a new way of denying humanitarian access, which seems very systematic and of course leaves people trapped in, for example, Eastern Ghouta, very, very vulnerable. So new levels of horror in Syria, and we need to engage the whole international community to stop this now.
I mean, obviously, a number of figures are really horrific. The number of children killed, according to UNICEF, 910 last year, which was already a 50% increase. But since the beginning of this year, there are reports that already 1,000 children are killed. And this despite the fact that we were told there are now some areas, some so-called de-escalation zones where people are supposed to be protected, starting with Eastern Ghouta.
Exactly. And what we are seeing is actually that a complete failure of the so-called de-escalation zones. Things have only gotten worse since we were told that now there would be zones where people could feel safe. Things have gone worse in terms of people who have to flee, in terms of casualties, in terms of the humanitarian aid who are not reaching children and families, and of course of the bombing of civilian areas. And the way I see this, there's complete disregard for normal moral context in Syria right now, but also for the laws of warfare. And it looks like the warring parties, they go into these new levels of horror with a complete lack of responsibility, and also knowing that they will experience impunity. And this is what we are calling for today. Look at the new levels of horrors in Syria. And to the whole international community, I feel that we are at risk of everything that we have built up for years and years and years in telling people that we have an international community who can protect children in these kind of situations. If we can't protect them now, when can we protect them?
Obviously, this begs the question of the attitude of Western countries. In mid-2017, when Russia, Iran and Turkey came up with those 4 de-escalation zones, people saw it, okay, maybe it's not peace, but at least it's going to halt the war. Was the West naive or cynical in believing those 2 countries? Because when we watch those de-escalation zones, they actually should be probably called escalation zones instead.
Well, I think we were all hoping that the de-escalation zones would be working. But what we are saying today is that since we had the de-escalation zones, things have actually gone worse, and they are a complete failure. We also have a UN resolution that no one seems to be respecting at all. One of the issues in the UN resolution is that very sick people, and particularly children, should get access to get out to get medical treatment. As I speak to you today, not one child have had access to leave the war zones and get medical treatment. Hopefully that will change within the next hours or days. I'm still hoping. But what we're seeing now is that that resolution has not been respected at all. So I'm always hoping that the next step and the next resolution will be something for the good for children. But what we're seeing now is a worse situation in Syria in many aspects than we have seen for 5 years for the children that are suffering there. And don't forget, this is not just civilians dying from bombs raining down on them. It is also children who have never seen any day of peace in their whole life. These children do not know what a normal life is. And when we ask them, which we actually do via our partners inside Syria, we can also see that the toxic stress that these children are facing will mean that it will be very, very difficult for them to at any point in time return to normal life. Don't forget that more than 1 million children are not in school in Syria because their schools and their hospitals and what should be safe places are continuously being bombed.
Right, and of the 6 million or so internally displaced people, roughly half, 2.8 million, are children. Would you say that, obviously, stopping the war is the priority, but already that there is a lost generation in Syria? I was reading that you had conducted some assessments in northwest Syria, if I'm not mistaken, and trying to figure out the level of those children when it comes to school. And what you found is basically that they had not gotten the education they deserve, and that's probably not going to change and even get worse.
Exactly. So that is why in many ways, we are stealing these children's future twice. First of all, they live in this horror. Many of them have to flee where they come from, or they get denied normal health services or even food. So this is the first time we steal their future. But we also steal their future when they can't access school and when we leave them with the invisible wounds of war, which is basically the toxic stress that means that these children will find it very hard to live in normal, peaceful times. So that is why we are urging the international community to do even more than they have tried until now to help the children of Syria. We are seeing new horrors. And actually, I will be honest with you, I never thought that I would sit here and say that we are seeing new levels of horrors in Syria. We've seen so much in Aleppo a few years back, and now we are seeing new horrors in Syria where things that we shouldn't accept from a moral standpoint or from a legislative standpoint. We shouldn't accept that humanitarian access looks like it's being used as a weapon of war, where we also have UN saying that chemicals are used as weapons, and where places where people live and try to live are being bombed and shelled. This is what's happening in Syria right now, and the international community needs to do more to stop it.
And in addition, in the north of Syria, there's now military intervention by Turkey in the region of Afrin. The Turks are saying they're doing their utmost to spare civilians, but there are also concerns that this could, in the end, hurt civilians, and is probably already doing so, including children.
I think what we have learned over the last 7 years in Syria is that when bombs and warfare moves into big cities, and they have a number of big cities in Syria, this will always be a war on children. This is what's happening because children live there. If you have a population, half of them will almost always be children, and they're trying to live their lives. They're trying to go to the marketplace, even go out to play, which they can't, of course, in many places in Syria right now. They want to go to school, and we have run via partners. We've run schools in cellars and places where the children thought they were safe, and of course, children also have to reach health facilities. This is what is happening in Syria right now. When war moves into cities where people live, it is actually a war on children, and that's what we're seeing in Syria right now.
And that's what your organization and others have been announcing in Yemen as well. Obviously, it's much less in the news, but Save the Children has described the situation as, quote unquote, a living nightmare where children starve to death daily and are shelled and bombed in their homes and schools. Obviously, there are questions about the role of Saudi Arabia and the backing it is getting from Western countries, including weapons, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, we don't talk so much about Yemen, and sometimes Syria even leave our TV screens. So we kind of think, is it better there or is it not? The case is things are worse in Syria, and the case is it's also the case that Yemen is perhaps the most dangerous place to be a child right now. It's the biggest humanitarian crisis on earth. We are seeing 130 children dying every day from simple diseases that could have been prevented if they had access to the most minimal health care, which they don't. Because in Yemen, as we're seeing in Syria, denial of humanitarian access is also being used as something that looks like a weapon of war. And who is suffering from that? We know that is the most vulnerable people. That will be children, of course, their mothers, infants who are suffering when they can't get access to food and to simple medical assistance. So that's what we are seeing in Yemen right now. And again, this is a situation we cannot allow ourselves to just forget that these children exist, because when war moves into cities, when humanitarian access is used as something which is being denied in a situation of war, the people who will suffer most are the most vulnerable, and we know who they are. They are the children.
Just very quickly, do you want the West to put more pressure on Saudi Arabia and its allies to stop that war? Should this be done now?
I want all of us, the whole international community, to put pressure on all the warring parties. And if they can't do nothing else right now, at least allow humanitarian access. That goes for Syria and that goes for Yemen. And allow the most sick to leave the areas where there are war and get access to hospitals that are not being bombed. This is what we're asking for now. And it shouldn't be that difficult. We're not trying to change the whole world from one day to the next, but at least allow humanitarian access, stop bombing civilian targets, and particular targets where we know that children are, schools and hospitals. It's against the law, and it's against every moral fiber in our bones that this should be happening. So this is what we're urging the world community: stop the wars in Yemen and Syria.
Helle Thorning-Schmidt, thank you very much for being with us from London, and thank you for watching this edition of The Interview here on France 24.